Good evening, everyone, and welcome to See Yourself Running, the realities of running as an election administrator. My name is Candace Harris, and I'm the Midwestern Regional Director for Run for Something and have the pleasure of being your host and moderator for tonight's event. First, a few housekeeping items before we get started. We have a lot of folks on the call tonight, which is super exciting, and we'd love for you all to interact in the chat. Make sure that you change your settings to all panelists and attendees. Share your name, where you are, and what brought you to the call this evening. Also, feel free to use the chat box to comment on the program and interact with other attendees. This is a great way to get to know people and help build community. After we have our initial panel discussion, we will open up the floor for questions. Please use the question and answer function. It's a question and answer box right at the bottom of your screen. We will be pulling questions for our panelists from there, not from the chat box. For this webinar, we are using the Zoom live transcription services. If you would like to view live captions on your screen, please click the More menu in the lower right-hand corner and select Show Subtitle. And later during the call, we will launch a poll. So if you'd like to get engaged with the next step in working with Run for Something, you'll be able to opt in there. Okay, that's it for housekeeping. So let's get into the program. We're so glad to have you all here tonight to discuss what it may look like to run for an election administrator position in 2022 or beyond. Whether this position is called a county clerk or recorder, these positions often fly under the radar on election day, but can make an incredible difference in making voting accessible to all eligible voters. During and after the 2020 election, Donald Trump claimed election fraud in an attempt to erode faith in our voting systems. In 2021, at least 18 states have passed laws to make voting harder. Voting rights legislation languishes in the US Senate and won't pass unless multiple senators cave on their opposition to eliminating the filibuster. But in spite of all of that, we still have an opportunity to safeguard our elections through election administration officials, many of whom are elected on the county, city, or town level. In 2022, there are over 3,000 of these positions on the ballot. This represents a unique opportunity for us to push back on these new anti-democracy laws by bringing in a new crop of innovative, pro-democracy election administrators who will ensure that elections in their areas are accessible, fair, and equitable. Because these elections are so important, Run for Something is organizing a program to focus on recruiting and supporting election administrator candidates in 2022, and this webinar is our kickoff. When you decide to run, we'll be excited to work with you through the endorsement application process and then have particular training sessions just for 2022 election administrator candidates throughout the year. Before I jump in to introduce our panelists, I want to take a moment to review what Run for Something is all about. Well, we encourage young, diverse progressives to run for local and state office. More specifically, Run for Something endorses diverse progressive candidates who are aged 40 and under, running for the first, second, or third time, and running for down ballot offices. Those include city council, mayor, county commission, state legislature, school board, county clerk, sheriff, district attorney, and so on. And since Run for Something started in 2017, we have identified more than 85,000 young people who want to run for office and have endorsed over 1,800 all-star candidates in all 50 states. To date, Run for Something has elected more than 630 candidates to state and local office in 48 states. And our winners are 57% women, 58% people of color, and 21% LGBTQIA+. We also provide coaching for our endorsed candidates to support you through every phase of your campaign. We provide resources, trainings, and connect candidates with partners who can help their campaigns. We also work with our alumni to support current candidates and to make connections that will help them govern successfully once elected. We do this because we know that more young, diverse, and exciting progressives running strong grassroots campaigns across the country will increase immediate turnout for Democrats up and down the ticket and help build political power for underrepresented groups across the country. And it will also change the conversation about who is electable in this country. At Run for Something, we focus on local, county, and state offices because these elected leaders directly influence people's everyday lives. And in these election administration roles, especially influence the ability for all eligible voters to vote and for elections to be executed fairly and accurately. So we truly hope this call will either help you in your run or convince you to consider running in your community. Okay, well, with that said, let's introduce our wonderful panelists of Run for Something elected election administrators. So first we have Catherine Clark, who serves as the Santa Fe, New Mexico County Clerk. Catherine was first elected to her role in November 2020. She's a small business owner with over 10 years of management practice, which helps her to build effective teams. Catherine believes that we need to make it easier for people to vote, not harder, and protect their access to the ballot. Thanks for joining us tonight, Catherine.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everybody.
Thanks. We also have George Stern, who serves as the Jefferson County, Colorado Clerk and Recorder. George was elected in 2018, and Jefferson County, Colorado is actually the state's most important swing county and one of the top bellwether counties in the country. Thanks for joining us, George. Next, we have Brianna Lennon, who serves as the Boone County, Missouri Clerk. Brianna was first elected in 2018 and has been working to make elections simple, accessible, secure, and transparent throughout her term. She actually previously worked at the Secretary of State's office and also worked with local election authorities and is now proud to serve as one of them. Thanks for joining us, Brianna. And last, we have Gabriela Casares Kelly, who serves as the Pima County, Arizona Recorder. Gabriela made history in 2020 by becoming the first Native American elected to a Pima countywide seat. She ran on a platform of creating and transforming spaces to include Indigenous voices and the voices of those who are historically underrepresented in her county. Thanks for joining us, Gabriela. And now I will pose the first question to all the panelists. Anyone can jump in first to answer this one. And we would just like to know, why did you decide to run to be an election administrator? Catherine, since you're off mute, you can go ahead.
So I actually have a personal story about this. The small business I owned was actually campaign consulting, and I've been in politics a long time. I was a union organizer, sat on a police review commission, and I actually helped a friend run for office, and we were young and going to college, and we thought, since there's 30,000 students at this university, maybe we should have student representation. So we ran for city council. And at that time, California had paper ballots that were not ballot on demand. They were pre-printed. And we had registered all these voters in the dorms. And then when they all went to vote, they ran out of ballots. And many students were turned away that day. And then the provisionals, of course, we had to wait for provisionals to arrive. It was a total disaster. And so while I sort of went into politics and started running candidates for office, I always knew in the back of my mind, I wanted to make sure elections were fair, modern, and transparent. So that's the reason I ran for office.
You can go ahead, George.
2 words, and because they've already been said, I don't feel like I need to give you a warning, but they are Donald and Trump. I had worked in the public sector before the 2016 election. I'd been a public high school teacher. I had served during law school in my local governor's office here in Colorado and in the Obama administration. But I was very happily in 2016 in the private sector paying off law school debt and knowing I'd return at some point, but not knowing when, until the 2016 election happened. And that was all the wake up call I needed. And I started right away heading out into my community and figuring out how I could get back into the public sector. Had no intention of running. Run for Something still was a year away from existing at that point, so didn't have someone to give me that push, but started looking around and found other people, stepping up into local offices, into running. And what I found was that no one was willing to challenge this 20-year incumbent we had, who was our elected clerk and recorder here in Jefferson County. And I happened to be the only one with a screw loose enough to think that maybe that was a good idea. Had done a lot of election protection and voting rights work in my in my past when I was in the public sector. And so had my eye on that office, I think if anyone else had decided to run, I would have happily gone and continued to be a staffer as I had been, but because no one was willing to, I did. And thanks to a lot of things going right, here I am a few years later, and very happy to be back in the public sector with all of you.
Gabriella or Brianna, would you want to?
I'll go if you're going to make me. I keep seeing Gabrielle looking at me. So I actually got into it from a purely kind of academic interest perspective. I had gone to law school and really just fell in love with elections, did internships in the Secretary of State's office, and then ultimately worked in the Secretary of State's office for Jason Kander. And through working on statewide issues, got to really appreciate all the work that was happening at the local level. So I came into it because I had seen the policies that were getting enacted, whether they were good or bad, that whether they were good or bad actually fell down to how they got implemented once they hit the local election administrator level. So I wanted to make sure that the policies that got passed that were good were actually working for voters, and the ones that were bad were mitigated for voters. And so that drew me to county government.
Skugtash, everybody. Anya Yaptugi Gabriella Gasvis Kelly, Bismolchkuk Amjad. I always introduce myself in the traditional way. My name is Gabriella Gasvis Kelly. I'm from the communities of Bismo and Kuk, which are on the Thonapam Nation, which is right here in beautiful Pima County, where I'm now the recorder. And I actually had absolutely no interest in running whatsoever. I was very happy being an academic advisor at a tribal community college, and I was asked to host a voter registration table that I thought would take 2 afternoons. And we ended up having a lot of questions that led me to looking at the recorder's website and calling the recorder and visiting the recorder's office and doing a lot of work with the recorder's office to try to make this information more clear for the Native community, that people were complaining, you know, hey, they don't participate. And so it turns out that it was really difficult to get those folks registered to vote. When I found out that the recorder who had been in office 28 years was retiring, my first thought wasn't actually to jump in the race. My first thought was, is this person who fills this position going to be anti-Native? Are they going to be a white supremacist? Somebody who does not value all of the things that I have brought attention to under the previous recorder? And I was really worried about that. And then I realized, wait a minute, I care about all those things, and I know about all of these things and what's needed in these areas and these communities, and I care a lot about voting, and I'm qualified. So I decided to run.
Thanks so much. We're so glad you did, and we're so glad that all of you all are running and serving. So Brianna, this next question is for you. On the Run for Something podcast last month, you called yourself an elections nerd and talked about your own election administrator podcast called High Turnout, Wide Margins, where you speak to election officials across the country. From your perspective, what are some of the skills you think are most relevant for running for an election administrator job?
Well, first, we're very lucky that we have 2 of our guests on this panel as well. George and Gabriella have both been on the podcast, and it's a very common thread, I think, in answering the question about skills that I've been finding and my co-host has been finding as we've been talking to people, is you really have to care about voter education. You really have to care about being authentically informative, and really voters know if you care whether they vote or not. People know when you're talking to them that, you know, if you're just phoning it in, or if you really care about going above and beyond and saying, yeah, my job is to count the votes, but like, I'd like to count a lot of votes. I would really like if everybody voted. So just having a deep-seated passion or interest in doing elections work, and also caring a lot about details. Elections is an incredibly detailed job. It requires a lot of contingency planning. It requires a lot of planning for the worst case scenarios. And you have to enjoy doing that, or at least find somebody on your staff that enjoys doing that, because it's going to be the biggest part of your election job, especially if you look at the last year where we're, preparing for historic turnout, preparing for all eventualities, and then COVID hits as well. So I think if you take what you've seen in happening in the last year and say, okay, well, if I still care about making sure that people can vote, if I still care about making sure that our democracy is healthy, that's the first thing, that's the first question you have to answer, and the first characteristic you have to have before you become an election administrator.
Thank you so much. So Gabriella, this next question is for you. Tell us how you found that you could make a difference in voting equity for Native Americans through this elected position.
Oh yeah, so that was the thing that brought me into this position. Like I said, I had been working at a tribal community college, which is a public institution just like any other community college. It's just focused for Native Americans. And we had a lot of Native Americans and non-Natives who attended my institution. And when we tried to register folks to vote, we were finding that even the question, are you registered to vote, was confusing. And that's because in a tribal community, you are able to participate in tribal elections. And there may or may not be a voter registration requirement for that tribe. There are 22 distinct tribal nations in Arizona, and there's 574 within the country. And Native American communities are kind of intertribal. Like, you don't necessarily only have, whatever tribe, if you're on a reservation, you might have Fauna of them and Navajo and Apaches and, some tribe from South Dakota. And so those questions are kind of confusing. And so even just the way that the language was, is this for tribal elections or local, state, and federal? And it helped make that click for people who weren't quite understanding that there were two different processes and there were two different requirements for those different functions. And so really simplifying the process and demystifying the process was incredibly helpful. And it's not that, this are revolutionary things that we're talking about. These are just logical, basic things that maybe, nobody has ever explained before, that there's a different process for tribal elections and local, state, and federal, and how to participate. And so it was really, that has been a really big change, of course, for my community. I was also able to open an early voting site that the previous recorder had closed. That was a huge thing that they did, because our pre-clearance requirements through the federal government aren't there anymore, and they were able to, and they didn't think it was valuable. The other thing is providing people with information, non-Native folks, and helping them understand some of these concepts that they've either never had access to, or they've been embarrassed to ask, or worried that they're going to offend somebody. Being able to be in these spaces and talking about Native communities and representing, just everyday 21st century folks, that has been something that has been really transformative. I literally used to have people say to me, or people still say this to me, like, I've never met a Native American before. I've never seen a Native American before. And then you have this 21st century Native who's on Twitter and TikTok and, doing all of these things. And I'm also an elected official, and it totally changes the perspective on what they thought a Native American was. So we don't know what the effects have been, but it's been a lot. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. And for anyone who's watching this, go follow Gabriella on TikTok. You will not regret it. So Catherine, this next question is for you. Tell us about when you first thought about running for office and what was going through your head. What did you decide? Why did you decide that running for this election administration office was right for you?
Well, it's kind of funny because I used to run candidates. And so, I always saw it from one side, which was candidates would tend to get scared and have a lot of self-doubt. They say that women need to be asked to run for office 10 times. Communities of color need to be asked even more. So if there's someone in your community that you think should run for office, definitely tell them. And it actually took me taking an Emerge training course, to do a Wellstone training, to be really heavily involved in my local Democratic Party. And then the local county clerk had termed out. And a lot of the things that I had experienced as being a campaign manager and seeing how voters were reacting from one side of the aisle, right, as the sort of the end user, I was really interested in, and it just seemed like the time to pull the trigger. She was termed out and it was time to run in the Democratic primary. And I sort of reached out to people I trusted and got their advice, and they said, yeah, run for it, go for it. You're a super nerd about elections, you're a super nerd about data. This is a great job for a detail-oriented, want to change things, doesn't take no for an answer kind of person. So I ran for office, but to feel scared, to feel like that sort of imposter syndrome, that's totally normal. Don't let that dissuade you.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And I always like to say on these calls, if you're on this call, like consider this your first time being asked to run, your first of many.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Catherine. George, next question's for you. Once you decided to run, who did you talk to and what did you need to learn? How were community groups, elected leaders, and other political organizations helpful to your campaign?
I was just going to say, after I heard Catherine say that I'm asking all of you right now to run. So count this as 2 times now that you've been asked to run in the last 5 minutes as your tally ticks up. So yeah, once I got to the decision, once I'd been asked enough and got to the decision of running, I then needed to learn a whole lot. So as I mentioned, I was going up against an incumbent who had been in the office for 20 years, had actually worked in the office for 60 years, and had a lot more experience than I did. Having worked, as I said, in election protection and voting rights, I had not actually run any elections or knew specifically about election administration or the other areas of the office that I would be overseeing. So I reached out immediately to a bunch of other clerks in Colorado who I thought might return my call and be willing to meet with me, and ended up shadowing several of them for a day or more to learn from them about what it was that was in the office, which I think was important to do well before I ever took office, because it allowed me to speak much more coherently, especially against such an experienced incumbent, about what I thought could be done in our office, what the opportunities were, and where I thought we needed change. That was so that I could speak coherently. So that I could actually get elected, I reached out to a bunch of people as well. So I started by reaching out to every elected official in the county, from state reps and state senators to our member of Congress, and asked them, just let them know I was running, and asked them if I could pick their brain for a few minutes. And most said yes, and were willing to get coffee or at least have me come join them as they canvassed door to door so that we could talk while working. And asked them a few questions like, who else should I be talking to? Who are great volunteers who could help me? I've got to win a 600,000 person race against an entrenched incumbent. Who are the people I can rely on to do this with fewer resources? And they gave a lot of great ideas and gave me some of my earliest and best volunteers. I also realized, though, that there was a lot of overlap, and I was hearing people who were already sort of involved in the system. So the final piece of advice I'd give you is, when you're looking for voters, people who you're not going to reach from going to the same Democratic meetings over and over, or the same business associations or Lions clubs, try to think outside the box of where you find people who are in your daily life who aren't so involved in the political process. So for me, I happen to be a volunteer firefighter, and that was like a huge new universe of people who weren't into politics really at all and spanned the political spectrum. But you don't have to be a firefighter to find those folks. I'd encourage you to think about any way in which you interact with people outside of politics. So is that your kid's daycare or your kid's school or sports teams or your book club or sewing club, or any academic center you're affiliated with, anything really where you're not going to find the same people you're going to find at those political club meetings, so that you can get in front of more people, you can find out what they care about, but where they get their information from, and really try and broaden that circle from what you're going to hear from the same elected officials who've been doing it the same way for a long time.
Candace, I actually wanted to say something about that too. So I think all of that is really great advice, but let me share a little bit about bad advice.
I think it's in it. We're talking about diversity, right? And we're talking about the need for diversity, the need to have young people. For me, I actually talked with an elected official who told me, a Latino election official who told me that I needed to tone down the Native, that I needed to be less of who I am and talk less about what brought me to the office and what I could do for other people, and how I could be less threatening to non-Native people living in urban areas. First of all, one thing that happens, like when you run for office, all of a sudden, even if you're a very confident person, your confidence goes out the window. And so you start questioning everything. And so I questioned this for a very long time, a couple of weeks. I couldn't even, I'm a writer. I couldn't even write the little blurb for my website to get it up there. And, people were breathing down your neck. They're trying to get you to create all of this content. And I couldn't do it. And I was really freaking out. And I went to an arena training, and Amy Allison from She the People happened to be there. This is pre-COVID. I think we were in a room full of like 300 folks, mostly Black and brown folks, mostly from Arizona. And she got up on stage and she said, if there is anybody who is making you feel less of the badass Black, Indigenous, badass that you are, you need to swipe left. Those are not your people. And then you need to go find your people. And I think that was one of the things that was one of the hardest lessons for me, because I assumed that, even like Latino electeds and other folks would be on my side and would want to celebrate my diversity and what I bring to the political realm. And I was so surprised at how many allies really wanted me to kind of quiet that down. But I'm literally like, I look like this all the time, like not just for TV. And so I'm like, literally, how do I walk into a space and talk about what brought me to this office and the things that I think are important if I can't talk about who I am and where I come from and the work that I've done in my own community? And so I think that that's also something to take into mind. If you cannot find somebody who's going to support you, you need to go looking elsewhere. You need to continue to look for the people who are going to celebrate you and not try to suppress who you are and change who you are, because there's a reason that you're there. There's a reason that you're showing up to these things. And you really need to lean into that and take those risks.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, George and Gabriela, those were two really important perspectives. And yes, it is important to also point out when people give you bad advice. And I'm glad that you empowered everyone on this call to remember why they're running and why they're stepping up to do this. So Catherine, this next question is for you. We've heard that running for office has a lot of similarities to starting up your own business. As a small business owner yourself, how did you find those skills to be helpful in running your campaign? And also now as you serve as the county clerk?
So I think the small business owner perspective was actually really helpful in developing my platform. I really wanted to make sure that our clerk's office was very sort of customer service oriented or constituent services oriented. So when I am a county clerk, a lot of the decisions I make is very much focused on the end user. How is this voter going to perceive this website? How is this voter going to know where their ballot is and whether it was counted? How are we going to do records and recording? So we've sort of started taking credit cards. We start texting voters their status of their ballot now. We have an easy URL, santafe.vote, so it's easy to find voting information. We have a voter outreach program. So we're really focused on kind of the customer service oriented. And I think it also, when you are a small business owner, it means that the business makes or breaks with you. And so it really makes it easy for me to answer calls from constituents. I don't know if other elected officials have been feeling the frustration of COVID, but certainly people are very frustrated right now. And they do not use very nice tones when they call you. And so you have to be really good about de-escalating, trying to find a solution, being good at listening. It's interesting how COVID has kind of turned everything up for people, and being in public service right now is quite challenging. And I think that, I'm good at seeing the big picture. I'm good at planning. I'm good at scheduling. I'm good at delegating. I had to learn a lot of things, jack of all trades. So, I had to learn a little bit about everything to be able to manage this sort of big, slow moving, but also really quickly happening election cycle. There's always an election happening. And so we just did a special election, then a regular local election. Now we're moving into a local municipal election. Then we're going to be doing the primary, and then we're going to be doing the general. And it's like, even though it's the same thing over and over again, every time it's a little different, either because the legislature passes a new rule, or it's a slightly different election because there's a new challenge like COVID. So, all of those skills are really important. If you're good at event management, if you're good at project management, if you're good at kind of working with people and getting them organized, all of those skills are really great for being either a clerk or election administrator.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. Brianna, this next question is for you. So once you started running for office, how did you speak to voters about the responsibilities of an election administrator? What kind of education did you have to do when speaking to voters to get them motivated to vote?
So one of the things that I think probably everybody has encountered that's on this panel is that most people don't know what our offices do in the first place. So we all knew because we were interested enough to get involved and wanted to run. But I will tell you, a large portion of the phone calls that my office gets anyway thinks that we're the circuit clerk and can handle their court cases for them. So we're already, starting from that disadvantage of, well, nobody knows what the office does, so why would you care about it? So a lot of my first conversations with voters were about, do you care about elections? Do you care about voting? Do you care about who represents your community? All of that starts in the county clerk's office. All of that is a series of decisions that an elected election official makes. Your experience at a voting booth depends on who's sitting in the county clerk's office. In our office, I was very fortunate that we had a longtime county clerk that had created a really good base of accessible voting, and she was very, very well known, but that didn't translate necessarily to the office being that well known. So everybody knew who she was, but they didn't know that it was the county clerk's office doing this stuff. I also got a little bit lucky because she ended up having to step down, and our governor made an appointment, and that appointee made a series of mistakes, including things like closing polling places that were at the housing authority, which meant specifically low income people of color and disabled people lost their polling locations in the first election that he ran. So it made it very obvious that I could educate people and say, that is the kind of thing that happens when you don't make your voice heard and who's going to be sitting in the county clerk's office. So bringing up examples like that, even if it's not your own local office, if you're not running against somebody where it's an open seat, you can use those as an example, and just kind of laying out, here are all the parts of an election administration job. And at any given point in making those decisions, you as a voter are going to be impacted by them. And if you care about being able to vote, then you should care about who's in this office.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a really good point to make, that a lot of folks don't know, but unfortunately, when stuff like that happens, it's good that we've got people like you in office. So Gabriella, back to you. You built up a significant community in person and online in support of your campaign. Can you tell us a bit more about how your campaign accomplished this connection?
Well, the in-person stuff, that actually had been building over a number of years. I had been volunteering, I'm a precinct committeeman for the Democratic Party. After I started doing voter registration at the tribal college and we finished and we got everybody there, then people were asking, oh, well, my auntie or my boyfriend or my cousin needs to register. And so we would go to local, my friends and I actually started a community organization called Indivisible Dono, specifically for education and civic engagement for members of our tribe. And so we would go out into rural communities all over the place. And so people had already been seeing me do this work. If there was a protest, if there was an action, if there was a strike, I would show up and I would just, and it wasn't to build a base. I guess that was kind of a byproduct. It was to go and learn and to be in those community spaces. And it was what we just did. My husband and I were very active in the community. And so when I decided to run, it was more like I was informing the community that I had already built. And then when we talked about online, yeah, I have no idea how that happened. A lot of things, the online presence has been really interesting because every time I'm thinking, oh, I shouldn't post this. And then I post it and then it kind of goes viral. That is really strange to me. But what was happening is, let's say, for example, you're told, no, nobody wants to read really long stories. You really need to give them nuggets of things. And I would think, well, this deserves a bigger explanation. I'm going to write a whole story. And I would, and people would screenshot it and they would, share it. And I could see that people had interest in it because I was talking about things that people had never heard of before, never made the connection, like talking about how white supremacy impacts your voting rights, or talking about the prison industrial complex and how that disenfranchises whole families and communities. And so those are concepts that people had never really heard about. And so then I'm talking about them, or I'm making a connection between the road, that floods in your community, which most people think is an annoyance. But really, if you break it down, if that road is flooded and on one side is your family member experiencing a crisis and the other side is the emergency services, that's really a life or death situation. And that decision was made by either an elected or somebody who was appointed by an elected to create that budget. And so really breaking it down and demystifying and not treating people like they're stupid, not blaming the voters. It was really about, nobody knows this information. Did you know this? One of the other things that we did was we worked really hard to make things culturally relevant. So one of the things that we did was we put out, and I can't even find one, I'll have to, oh, here it is. The Indigenous woman coming through, again, people were telling me not to be Native, like I didn't know how to do that. But putting out content that was interesting and culturally relevant and fun, that's a thing that I do on all of my social media, is I just try to have fun and be a normal person. And so the authenticity of that, and like I said, sometimes I would do things and I would think it would go viral and then it doesn't, and then I'm just being a dork and it would go viral. So I think that is something that people just really responded to. And the excitement of these different perspectives and voices, I think that's what was really bringing people in. And I have no idea, I have like 20,000 followers on TikTok and Twitter, and I'm like, what? Like, how is this happening? But it sometimes, like today, I put up a 10 tweet thread, but they say that people on Twitter don't like to read, like they like nuggets of information. And so I just kind of if I think something needs to be talked about, I just talk about it, and people respond to it. I don't really know.
Well, thanks for all of that. I'm sure that gave some folks some great ideas, and I want one of those stickers. I'm sure somebody's going to ask how to get one in the chat. So George, this question is back to you. Tell us about some of the changes you've implemented in office to make voting more accessible to registered voters.
So for those of you who don't know the Colorado election model, I'm very fortunate to be in a state in which we have a really great base that I was coming into and building upon. So we were voting by mail long before COVID made that a cool thing to do. And almost all of our voters have been doing it for many, many years. What I walked into was a state with a great model and a county that was not executing on that model particularly well, because of the past that I talked about. And so the first thing I did was outline a vision of a 21st century clerk and recorder's office. Unfortunately, I'm not on TikTok yet like Gabriella, but I'm hoping she's going to teach me how to get there too, so we can really take it into the 21st century. And what 21st century meant for us in the election space was focusing on accessibility for voters, but also efficiency and transparency, because those ultimately go back to accessibility. So first of all, we have tons and tons of data in the 21st century and in elections. We should be using it. So 85% of our voters vote by drop box in Colorado. And we had in our biggest city in Jefferson County, 150,000 person city of Lakewood, we had one 24-hour drop box. That is the equivalent of having one voting location in a 150,000 person place. It's not good data, it's not good election administration. So we use data to drive those Dropbox locations. We've more than doubled the number of Dropboxes in the last 3 years, making sure that we're putting them in areas with lower turnout, with higher populations of low-income folks, of underserved folks, making sure that we're really getting these locations to where voters need them, to where voters are, and to where especially traditionally underserved voters are. We've also started things like live chat, meeting voters where they are. They expect to be able to get any type of customer service on their phone with a quick chat. So we have that during election time. You don't have to wait in line at a polling place or on our long phone lines. We started doing, of course, Spanish language materials, which we'd never had before, perplexingly. And so we're making sure, again, we're meeting voters where they are. And then in particular, what the data showed us is that our turnout was pretty darn good, thanks to our awesome model for seniors, and pretty darn good for people in their 40s and 50s. And then it just starts getting worse and worse and worse as you go down the chain. So we made a concerted effort to reach out to our high schoolers to really start getting them involved while they were young, if they weren't even old enough to, to help with things like voter registration. And then as soon as they were old enough, to get them started in our voting process so that they form that habit young. All of that around accessibility. We also, though, focused on efficiency, because here's the thing: when you take a long time to give people results, they start to lose faith in that election process, and then they start to be less likely to want to participate in that election process going forward. So made sure that we were making our processes much more efficient, bringing 21st century common sense to doing that. And then finally, transparency. And transparency requires, again, meeting people where they are, getting on social media, updating your website so that it doesn't look like it's from the 1980s, but actually has good information for people that's helpful to them. We really expanded ballot tracking here, which is starting to expand in a number of different jurisdictions. So you can get alerts on your, by text, by email, by phone, when we mail that ballot out to you, when we receive it back from you, so you can feel a lot better about the fact that your ballot's being counted. And then we've opened up our process to tours. So obviously a ton of questions right now about election administration. We were giving public tours on every election. And then finally, COVID, knocked us into the 21st century by saying, hey, why are you doing these tours in person? why not do it on Facebook Live, since people couldn't come in during COVID, but it's turned out to be much, much better at reaching many thousands of more people who have these questions. So every election we do a Facebook Live tour of our processes to show people what election administration is actually like, not about what they're hearing on cable news or in other sources, so that they can feel better about it. Because again, that transparency is critical to accessibility. People are only going to participate in elections that they feel like are secure and that their vote's actually going to count in.
Thanks so much for all that information. Now, this is our last question before we open up to audience questions, and this is actually directed at all the panelists. In the last few years, there has been a building mistrust and building misinformation campaigns about elections. What advice would you give to future election administrators about how to address this phenomenon? And I will just let whoever wants to take that first jump in.
So I've done it by really being very, very transparent and available to people who don't trust elections. So I actually talked to the Republican Party chair in my county. I've asked them to send people to be poll workers, and by being poll workers, that means that they're taking the training, they're learning about the process. I've gone to luncheons where I've gotten absolutely grilled and even yelled at about election process, and we've just agreed to disagree on certain things, but sort of talking them through a lot of misunderstanding. One example is a candidate said, the last county clerk uploaded 3,000 ballots, and that's suspicious because it's an even number. And I said, well, absentee ballots are put into lots of 25, and so only the uploads will be in ending 0 or 5, right? Because of how we tally the ballots in stacks of 25. And so, it's sort of a lot of misinformation. And I think as an election administrator, you do have to be somewhat nonpartisan. You have to strongly believe in what you believe in and are pushing your values and your beliefs, but you also need to make sure that you have an open door policy to people who really don't believe, because usually what happens is they've learned something that's not true, and the whole belief around the misinformation is on that one thing. And if you can sort of clarify that information, be transparent, as George was talking about, having tours, I really think we can sort of tamp down on some of this misinformation. Another thing you'll notice is the press is really not doing you any favors. They always on election day want to do a process story about how things are going horribly, terribly wrong, when they're just like little minor hiccups in the election process. And so, it's really important to sort of have a good relationship with the press and try to get them to not suppress votes by writing a story about how voting is hard, right? Because every time you tell a story about how voting is hard, it actually suppresses the vote, right? So we want to make sure that we have those conversations after an election, but during an election, we want to encourage people to vote. It's really easy. You should go out and vote. If you're online by 7 p.m., of course you can vote, that kind of thing. So I think it's really important to make sure that you are, wherever you are trying to be as open and transparent as possible, answer questions, and be willing to talk to people who really disagree with you completely, and to try to clarify with them or be transparent with them so they know that you're not really hiding anything. You're trying to make sure people can vote.
I wanted to add on to what Catherine was saying about working with journalists in particular. So one of the best things that we did, and it wasn't my idea, but I'm really fortunate to have a huge journalism school in my district. They wanted to do a full access photojournalism essay on election day from the minute, and this was November 2020, from the minute that we got into the office at 3:30 in the morning until we were done processing at the end of the night. That was an absolute godsend. So not only was it just really good to have somebody there that understood things, it also did help when those hiccups happen, because hiccups are going to happen. It's not going to be 100% perfect. In Missouri, we have a very limited absentee voting. We're not allowed to have drop boxes. We're not allowed to have early voting. So everything has to go as good as it can be on election day. So anything that happens, and things did happen, but because I had that person there and he was taking pictures and he had full access to it, he was the one telling his editors, everything's fine here. I mean, you may hear some stuff, but like, I'm watching them take care of it in real time. And so that was not everybody's going to want to have a journalist there. Not every journalist is going to want to be there for the entire thing, but I think that that can't be understated. There are a lot of times, and even when I talk to my colleagues too, there can be a real fear of trying to let people into that because you don't want to show that you are a fallible person and that sometimes mistakes can happen or that sometimes hiccups happen that are outside your control, which is why I said earlier, having plans, backup plans is so important. As long as you can be honest and say, we're taking care of this. Yeah, we know that this is an issue. It really kills the process story if you're not really, if you're not panicking, they're not going to be panicking. It's very much a, stay calm. The other thing I would add is keep it very local. And others might disagree with this, but, there's so much happening nationally. And when I go and I talk to my local party or I go and talk to, the Lions Club and things like that, people want to ask about all the stuff that's happening nationally. And I think, there's plenty of studies and research out there that shows that local election authorities get the highest levels of trust from their own voters. And keeping that trust is so important. And if everybody was doing that, then you'd all have trust in your own. I mean, the problem really is that people are looking at other states, casting aspersions on them, calling people that are not their own local county clerk, and then, saying that they trust what's happening, not trusting what's happening there. So when you're going out and you're talking to people, don't get sucked into that engagement about like, well, what about mail-in voting? If you don't have mail-in voting in your state, don't talk about mail-in voting. You can talk about it in concept as you think it would be a good thing, but there's no real reason to get in the weeds about why you think Pennsylvania's mail-in voting went awry. Like, stick with what you know, stick with what's going to affect your voters, and that'll help. I feel like that helps in the long run.
That's a waiting game of who is it, me or Jared?
Yeah, I agree. I jump on that bandwagon. I really struggled with this at first. I was really kind of surprised by the amount of attention that this office, which normally would have been a really sleepy office, the fact,
we normally would have been explaining what this office even does, and it was never a flashy office that people really were watching. And so number one, there's incredible amount of demystifying that we have to do just in general, and making yourself available. I agree with Catherine there. And but one of the surprising things I think was the press. And if something happens, I'm in Arizona, so Doug Ducey signs some weird law into some weird bill into law. Within 5 to 10 minutes, my office starts getting phone calls. And so rather than saying no comment, we were starting to take a look at what are the scripts that our staff needs to have so that they can confidently answer, or that they can send this information, or send this, the voter, the constituent to, this website, or to understand this process. And so we started putting out a lot of press releases. And one of the funniest things a staff member said to me the other day, because I was saying wow, there's so many press, so many journalists reaching out to us, and they're like, yeah, well, if you put out a press release, the press usually will call you. But having to do 6 interviews in one day, or by radio, or the local news, or print, and those types of different things, and then the idea well, we should be putting on press conferences and giving all of this information out, and then also explaining some of those commonly asked questions. If we're getting a question, more than 3 times, we have people yelling at my staff members my staff members don't need to be abused. We need to provide support, because obviously if people are calling and asking about that, they're feeling very scared and concerned. And so that's really important, is to be proactive and put out that information as soon as possible. The other thing that I think is really, really important to let people know, there is a small group of people who are making a lot of noise as conspiracy theorists, but there's an even larger group of people who have never been able to participate, who are unsure of how to participate, are intimidated to participate, and we also need to be thinking about those folks also. And so, it's a really interesting mix, and I'm in Arizona, so we'll see how this goes in the upcoming elections.
I think that last point Gabriella made is so important, and that's what I'd underline. I'd echo everyone in that transparency is critical. And the more you can be speaking to voters, and you have to be speaking to voters who disagree with you, you have to be speaking to ones who think that the system is rigged, because they might not believe anyone, but we are the most trusted source on this topic, and so we have to try. But there are some folks who are not going to be able to be convinced on this point. And that was a very hard lesson for my staff and me to learn over the last year, because we know we're running fair elections. We know there's things we can be doing to improve, but we know that there is not widespread fraud. We know that there are no grand conspiracies here. And some folks aren't going to be able to be convinced of that. And we can't spend all of our time talking to those few voters, wasting all of our resources on those few voters, when there's so many more who not only do appreciate the process and believe in the process, but who still need to be enfranchised into the process. And that's where we should be spending our time. And so getting my staff to recognize that they don't need to talk to the same person, be yelled at by the same person on the phone every single day, have a new conspiracy thrown at them as soon as they've disproven the last one that was brought up to them. And I think that's important in stepping into this role, to know not only to keep everyone focused on the fact that most people appreciate our systems, and the ones you're hearing from do not always represent the majority, but also that it is our duty to our voters, to our taxpayers, to be focused on the largest group possible, not on those yelling based on their extreme theories or on what they're hearing on the far reaches of the internet. And I think it's hard to do. It's really hard to do, but it's important to do.
Thank you all. That was all some really good advice. And I know we have some great questions in the Q&A, but before I open up the floor, I am going to launch a poll. So everybody on the call right now, if you are interested in talking about your plans to run for office and brainstorming next steps, please opt in for a call with a Run for Something volunteer. If you're running for office in 2022 and apply for endorsement, this volunteer call will serve as an endorsement interview. If you are still thinking about running, the volunteer will ask you questions that will help you figure out what to do next. So for anyone who opts into a call tonight, you're going to receive an email from a Run for Something volunteer. In the next few weeks, we have a lot of folks in the call, so it could take the next few weeks or up to a month. And they will reach out to you to set up a time where both of you all can talk. And it'll be about a 30-minute conversation where you can discuss your campaign plans and also just talk to them about why you're interested in running. I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds for you to answer the poll. Again, we're about to open up questions for our panelists. So if you haven't put your question in, you can go to more at the bottom of your screen, click on Q&A, and answer your question there. Okay. Awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and I actually see one or two questions about this, but someone has asked about how you actually start running when you're still working like a full-time job. I feel like that was applicable to a good bit of folks on the panel. So like, how do you actually manage that, just running? Yeah.
Yeah, so
plan for things in the evening and on the weekends, and plan to have absolutely no weekends. That pretty much every single night was, a meeting. There were constant meetings where you go and you talk for 2 minutes, and trying to find things like that. I was I worked in a high school when I started running, and you know, we got sent home because of COVID, and I had planned on working as a substitute the next year, and because of COVID, that really wasn't possible, and so I eventually ended up, as soon as my contract was over, I hired myself through my campaign, which was a controversial move. I paid myself, but really, um, I was I always talk about making sure that we are paying Indigenous women for their labor. And, you know, I had at the time been thinking like, oh, maybe I can get a job with Mark Kelly's campaign or Joe Biden's campaign. And then, you know, after a long day of work, then work on my campaign. Like that didn't make any sense. But me getting voters that Joe Biden couldn't get and Mark Kelly couldn't get was helping both of them. So I really had to recognize that, and I decided to pay myself. I paid myself like $15 an hour, minimum wage, or kind of minimum wage here in Arizona, and I ended up doing that. And my base supported me in doing that, and so it was really, really difficult. And it was a whole month where before I made that decision, where, you know, I was just coasting on savings, and, you know, that's not sustainable. But if we really, truly want that representation, we do have to push our community to support us in doing that.
Thank you so much. Catherine, were you about to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So I've actually coached a lot of candidates through this, and it's a lot of planning. So you have to make a calendar. I would absolutely say that you have to set aside time for your family or your spouse, or they might not be your family or spouse by the end. They might disown you. But it's a really lot of time management. It's really maximizing. If you are planning on running a campaign where you have to raise a lot of money, it's maximizing calling donors or talking to voters, and everything else should be a campaign coordinator, even if that's like your best friend who's volunteering for you and not getting paid. It's really important to make sure that you eat, you sleep, you realize you're not going to be doing too much anything else, but also that you are, doing your self-care stuff. Start early, do the easy stuff first. That's like reaching out to the Democratic Party and doing all that stuff. And then by the end, you're going to be running around doing 5 events on a Saturday kind of thing. COVID was really interesting because, my campaign went from sort of traditional campaign where you're going and you're giving a 2-minute speech and then driving to the next thing and give a 2-minute speech, to just Zoom call, texting, radio, mailers, right? So, same thing when you're actually an elections officer, is you have to be flexible, and things may come up on a campaign, but people do all the time have a job and run for office. Sometimes the last 2 weeks, they take that time off. They work with their family or their spouse to take the last 2 weeks off. It is possible. It's not going to work if you don't have a plan in advance and have a realistic expectation of how much money you can raise and how many volunteers you can get. If you can't get anyone to volunteer or give you money, that's maybe a sign that you haven't done enough networking to get out, to start. Usually campaigns, what happens is, the momentum starts building, people wanting to volunteer for you, wanting to help you, wanting to give you some money. And that's how sort of momentum builds in a campaign. Just because you can't do one or the other doesn't mean that you can never run for office. But it's usually a sign that, like, you need to start working on your networking if you can't do both right this second. You know what I mean? But it's really important to sort of, tap your friends, tap your contacts, try to get them to help you with your campaign. Because if you, like, elections admins used to not be a sexy thing to run for as much, right? People didn't know what it was. And those campaigns tend to be really small, just a couple $1,000s just for signs and radio. But now there's more and more interest. So I'm going to be interested to see how that goes. But I think, honestly, it's the whole idea of networking, talking to voters, fundraising, and making sure you have like mental health space, but do expect to do on the weekends, like 4 to 5 events, that kind of thing. So you will be busy. So
I'm glad you touched on fundraising, because there is a question in the chat about How do you just go about starting to raise money? Everybody's favorite topic when they're thinking about running for office. So if Brianna or George want to jump in about how they started to raise money for their campaign, like what does that look like? And even someone asked about like, you know, I know every election administration position might cost different, the races might cost different things in different places, but like, how do you go about figuring out how much money you need to raise?
I started with going through my phone, and you call everybody you ever knew. Before you start talking to political people for money, you have to start talking to your friends and family first. And, you know, you don't have to ask them for thousands of dollars. You ask them for 25, you ask them for 50, whatever. Sometimes because they're nice, they give you a little bit more. It's the opposite advice when you're calling donors, ask for more than what you want. But with your friends and family, you don't want to, you know, make them hate you. So start little, but start by asking everybody. My race, so it was countywide, and even though I was running against what would nominally be an incumbent, because he had been appointed, he was only in the office for 17 months by the time that all was said and done. So he didn't have a huge base to work with, but I needed my budget was about $50,000. For perspective, Boone County has about 120,000 active voters, and the majority of them are in an urban-ish area, for as large as our urban area would be in the middle of Missouri. And I had run for county government in 2016 as well. I was not successful. That one needed $100,000 because of who I was running against. So it's highly variable based on whether you're running for an open position, who you're running against. But also the other advice is, you know, create your budget, create your plan, talk to trusted advisors, and then raise what you need. Don't focus always on what the other person has. You know, they might have more than you, they might have less than you. If you have what you need to execute the plan that you want to do, then that's all you need to do.
I think that's all right. And in addition to who you're running against, obviously the size of your district, you can be running in a smaller county in which it's a lot easier to reach all of your voters, or in a county with hundreds of thousands of voters. And it takes, unfortunately, more money to reach all of those folks. But the thing I'd say is that fundraising sucks, and everyone thinks that. So know that we share that feeling with you, but it's important. It just is in our system. And so you do have to put in that grind. I found it to be, we were talking about timing of, you know, balancing it with life and everything else. It is one of the easier things to sort of squeeze in whenever you can and have small pockets. So when you're driving from event to event, or when you've got, you know, an hour in the evening where you want to just be done with work and everything else, it's kind of a good time to reach people because they're probably at home and more likely to pick up their phone. If you can't be calling people all the time, I found emailing people that I hadn't talked to in a while and maybe didn't have phone numbers for to work. Most people would tell you got to call them to get a good ask in, but some people, you know, are going to find it kind of weird to hear from someone on the phone they haven't talked to in 10 years, but an email can smooth that ask a little bit more. But you do have to ask everyone and just be competitive about it. Another thing that I found to work, I agree with Brianna, you don't want to make your friends hate you by asking for too much. One thing that was pretty effective and that I loved my past self for when I executed successfully was getting people to do small recurring donations. So just getting them to give 5, 10, 15 monthly means that 3 months later, when you're struggling to fundraise, it's really nice to have those $10, $15 just sort of showing up without having to have done anything for it. But you just got to ask and ask and ask, and know that none of us like it and none of us are great at it, but it's important.
I had some thoughts on this.
So, you know, I'm Native American, and I come from a community that is historically has low socioeconomics. You know, Native American communities are impoverished communities, and I really, like, I cried thinking about the idea that I would ask my community, for money for politics. And, I sat with a good friend, somebody who'd done campaign training, and she helped me recognize that, number one, if I don't ask my community, I'm making the decision for them whether or not they should be involved. And that's not fair. And that's not what I want. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people to invest in our future and our collective future. And if I don't ask my community, that's robbing them of an opportunity for them to do something that creates change. And that was really hard for me. Like, I have sat with this. I'm even now like thinking about how emotional that is. And so you have to ask. You have to ask because people want to be a part of that. They want to celebrate, and they just don't always know how. Some people will, and it is going and texting, or not texting, calling every single person, in your phone book, and just asking them and having a conversation. I don't know if you know that what I'm doing, but I'm trying to do something, and this is why, and I'm really hoping for support, and I'm super embarrassed to be asking, but can you donate $25? And that was a thing that really helped me ask over and over and over. And the other thing is, I talked about how I'm wordy. You can tell I'm wordy. I cannot be brief. I cannot put out an email like I see all of these national campaigns. There's like, click here if you want to protect democracy, click here, blah, blah, blah. I have to put out what is in my heart. And so I write every single email that goes out. It is written by me about an issue or about a topic. And I will spend as much time as I need to write. And again, those people responded to them. And we actually had a really, really successful email campaign where we would have like 20 or 30 people donating on one day, which is, I guess, not the average from emails. But because we were talking about real things, we're talking about really big concepts that needed to take that time. And so again, I think that is also something that's really important for you to talk about those struggles. Talk about, if you're working at the same time as trying to fundraise, talk about that. Like if you're struggling with childcare because you're campaigning, talk about it. Whatever it is, just talk about it, because that's what people are connecting with, that human aspect. And when they see people like themselves, they want to be invested in it. And so fundraising is super, super cringe, but it's part of the necessary. But ask your community to invest in you.
That is great. So we are coming up to the end of our time. We have a lot of great questions, and I really want to ask them all, but I do want to give, I'm going to ask a quick question to George, and if anybody else wants to jump in on that, and then we'll ask one more question, we'll wrap up. So someone asked you specifically about the fact that you unseated a decades-long incumbent. Like, what kind of things were you thinking about when you stepped up to run? Because that is a particular circumstance when you're stepping up to run against someone. And if anybody else was in this example, has this experience, y'all can jump in as well. But what did you think about? What did you talk about to persuade voters when you're trying to convince them that you're a young person who's viable and they should vote for you?
Yeah, and even harder in our particular positions, because clerks or recorders or clerks and recorders, whatever they're called, have some of the best name recognition in their areas because they're sending out the ballots every single election. They're sometimes, we oversee the DMV, they're sending out DMV notices. So it's hard, but it's important because this is an area where more than anything, we need new ideas and new competition. So first of all, I knew I might not win, and I was comfortable from that from the start. And you have to be, because these are elections and it's up to the whims of the voters. But I believed that I could win, and that was important too, because it made it possible to get up every day and keep trying on this. For me, it was very much, you have to, as we've talked about a lot in the past on this call, you have to be authentic and genuine. I was not going to try and be the more experienced candidate or win that fight. I was clearly the change candidate, and I was running on change. I was simply finding the things that voters didn't love. Who said it? I'm forgetting which of my three amazing colleagues here said it, but one of them was talking about how they capitalized on the fact that, the previous clerk had closed vote centers, and that you have to use that to say, hey, do you like what's happening here, or do you want to change that? You have to work hard to overcome the disadvantages of fundraising and name recognition. And I found it helpful to get in as early as I possibly could, to have the runway to do that, and to keep working for as long as I possibly could on it. But more than anything, it's about knowing that even when voters know someone really well, they're willing to vote change. We've seen that in a lot of elections, right? Great elected officials have won as the change candidate, and you could be the next. Let this be the third time I'm asking you, run.
Thank you all so much. I know I do definitely want to respect you all's time. Thank you all for joining us. Just real quick, if anybody has one parting word, if there is a little piece of advice that you would give yourself, knowing what you know now versus what you did when you started your campaign, what would you tell yourself? And y'all can just popcorn that around if you'd like to jump in before we wrap up.
Get comfortable putting out your opinions in whatever way that is, even if that's just Twitter. Put out your opinions.
I do too. Have fun. Someone said it, but make time for your family, which for me was having fun, but to have fun. Some of this sucks, especially fundraising, as we've talked about. Leave time to have fun. But two, Gabriella said it more eloquently than I ever could have, but be yourself. You can't run as someone else. You have to be authentic to yourself, and that's the most important thing.
I would say ignore the haters. There are just going to be people who just decide they don't like you for whatever reason. You're not going to convince them. It could be that you're a woman. It could be that you're Native. It could be that you're, how dare you challenge an incumbent, right? So you're not going to win. Don't focus on them. Just keep on focusing on winning more votes and hearts and minds.
I don't know that I have much to add other than make sure. So I was pregnant when I ran, which was really interesting, and we also had a 3-year-old. So make sure it came up before, but make sure you take time for your family, because the other thing is all those haters and things like that, your family has to watch that too. And I will tell you, for as much as I could just fluff off and say, that's what people are going to say. People are not going to like me. It's hard to swallow, but that'll happen. My family took it way harder, and they still do. My husband holds way more grudges than I do. So just be sensitive to that fact too, and make time for them.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all. This is, we're coming to the end. I wish we could go a whole another hour because you all had so much great advice. Thank you so much to our panelists this evening for sharing your experiences and wisdom with us tonight. Also, thank you to everyone who participated and asked these wonderful questions. Tomorrow, everyone who joined this call will get an email from us with resources from Run for Something to use as you prepare to run for office. And also, if you opted in to speak with a volunteer, look out for email in the next few weeks to schedule a time to talk. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We are here to support you on your next steps. Have a great night.